page 22 to 42 of the book Chicano Power and the Struggle for Aztlan. Section 1, History of Chicanos. The birth of Mexico. Ancestors of the Chicano people first stepped on the land that is now called the quote-unquote Southwest United States, end quote, which we know as Aztlan even before the Mayflower ship brought its horrors to these shores. Going back 50,000 years, civilizations existed on this continent, including the Aztecs, Olmecs, Zapotecs, Mayans, Incas, and other indigenous peoples. These cultures cultivated maize, corn, thousands of years ago and influenced life from the present-day Mississippi Valley to the southern tip of Chile. Aztec influence has been discovered far away from the quote-unquote Southwest. Quote, far to the east, the mound builders of the Ohio and Mississippi basins also evidently received Mexican influence in their construction of serpent mounds and small pyramid-based temples, as well as in pottery making, agriculture, and other cultural elements. Clearly, there was considerable early contact between the area of the southern U.S. and Mexico, end quote. The arrival of the European invader into the Americas in the 1500s was a formative event in future development of the Chicano nation. Spanish conquistadors landed in what is now the Mexican state of Veracruz in 1519 and quickly moved in to colonize the Mexicas, or what is commonly called the Aztec Empire. Spaniards began mining the region's resources with the help of exploited native and, in later years, mestizo, mixed native and Spanish labor. The unquenchable thirst for gold drove the Spaniards to deeper territory, leading to the naming of their colony New Spain in 1521. New Spain covered a vast territory that today is considered the southern United States, Mexico, and Central America. New Spain's capital was located on the conquered Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, located in the center of today's Mexico City. The increase in resource discovery fueled more and more mines, expanding into new land. The quest for more gold and silver led to the decimation of the indigenous populations. In the states that comprised northern New Spain at the time, such as California, the Spaniards had indigenous people, including mestizos, working as, quote, vaqueros, soap makers, tanners, shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, cooks, servants, pages, fishermen, farmers, as well as a host of other occupations, end quote. The people were worked sometimes to death. This work pushed economic development across the region, which was a precursor to nationhood. The Spanish colonizers started giving land grants in 1598 in an effort to stabilize their colony. Plots of land were given to families or villages to be used communally. Some grants were for single families to raise crops for the village or for commercial purposes. Some were given for workers in industries such as builders or in exchange for labor power. Some were meant to settle land or serve as a buffer zone against French or English encroachment. New Mexico was named by the Spanish colonialists after the Mexicano people who originally inhabited the territory at that time and was a major territory in the land grant campaign. Even then, New Mexico was a region which would develop significantly as part and parcel with the Chicano nation. The Spanish colonization expanded further with the expansion of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the royal road of the interior land, which was eventually reached from Mexico City to Spain's New Mexico. Along this route, many villages were destroyed and families uprooted for its construction. With the expansion of Spanish plunder, indigenous people and mestizos were forced into hard work conditions, which led to some of the first workers' strikes in 1631. New Spain operated as any other colonial power, on the sweat and blood of those it colonized. This brutalization led to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. It was initiated by natives and mestizos and soon spread and drove out the colonists until the 1690s. During the Pueblo Revolt, most of the records of the land grants that had been given out by the New Spain government were destroyed. For most of the 1700s, Spaniards used New Mexico as an outpost and frequently brought natives from as far south as Oaxaca to use alongside mestizos as slave labor or exploited workers. Some of these natives and mestizos fled into the villages of New Mexico, while others resisted with strikes and open revolt. At the time, the Mexicano peasants were living communally as small farmers and artisans, using barter systems. Their villages were self sufficient and relied on fishing, agriculture, and hunting small game. The Spanish found it harder to colonize the territory that is now the American quote unquote Southwest than it was to colonize the Valley of Mexico. The oppression faced by the natives and mestizos in New Spain created the social conditions for an uprising there as well. On September 16, 1810, they rose up against the Spanish occupiers. The initial uprising was smothered, yet resistance continued in guerrilla warfare units all over New Spain, eventually leading to Mexico gaining independence from Spain in what would be dubbed the Mexican Revolution. During the Mexican Revolution, the frontier garrisons of Spanish troops were sent from the northern states back into the interior, and in 1821, after a decade-long struggle, the people were victorious in the revolution. New Spain was toppled and the nation-state of Mexico was born. Although Mexico broke the colonial yoke of Spain, it continued to suffer from inequality, exploitation, and other residue from hundreds of years of colonialism. Colonization, development, and the U.S. War on Mexico. The 1820s began to see American advances toward Texas, which was then part of the newly independent nation state of Mexico. The white oppressor nation began to move in as immigrants into Texas, and the Yankees came in mass. The Mexican government had, quote, expelled all Spaniards, including Spanish missionaries, from its territories, end quote. The gente living in these areas were essentially untethered from the government. At the same time, mining opened up in the northern frontier, allowing a steady economy to continue. After the Santa Fe Trail opened in 1822, linking Franklin, Missouri with Mexico's Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Chicano nation really began to develop distinct characteristics from the rest of Mexico. The development of the Santa Fe Trail helped to open up trade between America and northern Mexico, making it cheaper to obtain goods from Americans than purchasing those same goods from the Mexican interior. The injection of American capital led to a wider gap between the Chicano nation and Mexico, and Chicanos began to develop their own classes. A bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie developed during this time, which for the most part dealt with American markets and not Mexican capital. The Chicanos were still being lynched, exploited, and oppressed, but a Chicano middle class began to arise. The state of New Mexico spearheaded economic development at a time when the majority of the population of New Mexico was mestizos. This friction led to many uprisings in New Mexico when the Mexican government attempted to tighten control. Class distinctions were more clearly developing in Alta California, where the Mexican government secularized all missions in the 1830s. Alta California was considered the area that is currently the states of California, Nevada, parts of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Being such a large territory with now secularized missions, Chicano culture began to develop independent of the rest of the country. Quote, the more rigid and feudal patterns of patron and peon never developed in California as in New Mexico, though there was a caste system. The Californians were divided into three classes. At the top were la gente de razón, landowners who constituted roughly 10% of the population. Members of this group held the important social, economic, and political positions and maintained tight control of their privileged states by marrying predominantly within their class. The second group constituted the majority of the population. Artisans, small landowners, vaqueros, herders, soldiers, some servants, and immigrant colonists. During the Mexican period, the term cholo was widely used for members of this class. Composed mostly of mestizos and mulattoes, they were generally illiterate as well as poor. At the bottom of the social ladder was the Indian, who endured a condition of hardship under the supervision of the padres. Exploited by the mission system, the Indian after secularization was reduced to a more desperate state, peonage, end quote. During this period, the indigenous people were not solely from Alta California. Many indigenous people were transplanted from the Mexican interior into Alta California to work the mines and other occupations. These class developments focused around agriculture and mining in the region, contributed to the development of Aztlan into a nation. The discovery of rich resources in Aztlan propelled America to begin its imperialist land grab. The mining industry ripped the Chicano peasants from the land they tilled and formed a Chicano proletariat. This newly formed labor force for the many mines ensured a source of wealth for whoever possessed this resource-rich area. Feudal and semi-feudal relations that had kept people isolated economically and culturally to the feudal who they worked for were changing into a capitalist economy. The influx of American settlers into Mexican territory included white supremacists like Stephen Austin, who was a psychotic racist believing the white nation was sent by God and superior to other peoples. In reality, Austin was a deranged slaveholder and a serial killer who hunted natives and Chicanos. Austin began organizing other white racist extremists to go to Tejas, quote, with a rifle, unquote. He pushed for Tejas's independence from Mexico, using legal and illegal means to occupy Tejas to promote white supremacy. It is thus no surprise that the city of Austin, Tejas, would be named after this maggot by America. Although Tejas was not ratified by the United States government as a state until 1845, in 1836, the American oppressor nation annexed the territory of Tejas from Mexico. The national legend of the Alamo takes place during the American battles to annex Tejas in 1835 and 1836. Quote, probably the most widely circulated story that was that of the last stand of the aging Davy Crockett, who fell fighting like a tiger, killing Mexicans with his bare hands. The truth, 7 of the defenders surrendered, and Crockett was among them. The Mexican force executed them, and one man, Luis Rose, escaped. End quote. The U.S. War on Mexico, 1846 through 1848, was one of the most vicious operations Mexicanos had faced since the Spanish arrival. The terrorism Mexicanos experienced was something only a barbarian could think of. Babies slaughtered, children raped in front of parents, parents murdered in front of children, bodies mutilated, churches desecrated, elderly people raped and murdered in front of children. The atrocities were so gruesome and morally bankrupt that hundreds of Irish soldiers deserted the U.S. Army to fight alongside Mexicanos against American soldiers. They were called the San Patricio Battalion, St. Patrick Battalion. U.S. President James Polk provoked this war on Mexico in order to expand the empire. He sent General Zachary Taylor to a contested area on the border and claimed Mexicanos fired on U.S. soldiers. This pretext lives on today in similar form. When American cops claim Chicano youth reach for their waistband, they justify their authority to murder innocents. This same preemptive strike excuse is even still used on a broader scale for war today. In 1846, Mexicanos dealt with the terrorists Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. And today, the Third World deals with SEAL Team 6, but it is the same performance, the same war crimes and crimes against humanity that we continue to fight and resist. Although most of the Yankees agreed with the taking of all of Mexico, employing a complete quote-unquote Saxonization of Mexico, some were not so sure and felt that incorporating a large number of Mexicans into the United States would ultimately come back to haunt America. Others were more blunt. As U.S. President Polk, Secretary of State James Buchanan put it, quote, "How should we govern the mongrel race which inhabits Mexico?" End quote. This was the general feeling from those in power in America, and this is what Chicanos have been dealing with living as an occupied nation. There were Mexicano militias that rose up to fight against Yankee imperialism. Juan Cheno Cortina, Francisco Varela, Gregorio Cortez are some of our national heroes of this time period. Groups like Las Gorras Blancas, the White Caps, armed themselves to defend the people from white supremacy and oppression. One such revolt was in New Mexico in January 1847, called the Taos Revolt, in which the American governor of New Mexico, Charles Bent, was assassinated. In fact, every one of the stolen states experienced revolts, and many groups arose to defend the people. In 1848, the U.S. war on Mexico ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States acquired about 50% of Mexico's territory, including the territories that were to become the states of California, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and Oklahoma. This geographical area is what Chicanos today consider Aztlan, our ancestral homeland. The initial proposal for the treaty included Articles 10, guaranteeing the protection of, quote, all prior and pending titles to property of every description, end quote. Quote, the treaty thus afforded rights to Chicanos that extended well beyond their constitutional guarantees, but neither the sovereignty of Chicanos as a nation nor their right to occupy land as a people were recognized. Individual land titles were to be respected ostensibly, but the wording of the protocol cast doubt on the validity of these titles. The protocol stated that these grants preserve the legal value which they may possess, and the guarantees may cause their legitimate titles to be acknowledged before the American tribunals. Not surprisingly, Chicanos did not fare very well before such American tribunals. Within 2 decades, most were landless. End quote. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, people of Mexican descent were supposed to be treated with dignity here in the United States. The treaty claimed all land belonging to those of Mexican descent would be honored, and people of Mexican descent would become full U.S. citizens within 1 year. This would ensure that the people would be free from oppression. The truth would soon become quite the opposite. Not only was a more brutal form of exploitation brought upon the people, but racism against Chicanos was now state sanctioned to promote this manifest destiny we have become all too familiar with. America began taking millions of acres of land owned by individual Chicanos or that have been owned communally by Chicanos for hundreds of years, dating back to the Aztec Empire and the Spanish land grants. This land grab was enforced by racist militia groups, white supremacists who flocked into America's newly expanded territory. Paramilitary groups like the Texas Rangers were known as quote unquote Mexican killers and hunted down defiant Chicanos and First Nations people. In this way, terror was institutionalized in Chicano and Native communities. Of course, some states within the quote unquote Southwest had more repression than others. For example, the California gold rush of 1849 saw an influx in oppressor nation immigrants who swarmed California from all parts of North America in their obsessive search for gold. States like Texas seemed to draw the most vile and depraved of the oppressor nation. New Mexico was a little different, and the oppressor nation focusing on opening up trade routes to the West Coast that could help capital flow freely from the West to the East Coast. In New Mexico alone, the federal government seized 1.7 million acres of communal land. This war and subsequent land theft has even been forgotten by many Americans who continue to occupy the Chicano homeland. Today, even Mexico downplays the land grab and the U.S. war on Mexico. The Chicano bourgeoisie has conveniently whitewashed this incident so as to secure their seat at the imperialist trough. The land theft and oppression did not sit well with Chicanos, and it was a significant event in the formation of the Chicano nation. Contrary to American propaganda and what is taught to our youth in America's schools, Chicanos did not quote unquote melt into American society, nor was the annexation a smooth process. Many Chicanos rose up, either on their own or organized into militias and revolutionary armed groups, to not just resist the oppression, but also to fight for self-determination. Repression of Chicano prosperity was not limited to land theft, but also to limitations on their ability to engage in work as free persons. In the early 1850s, the foreign miners tax was enacted in California, targeting Chicanos as well as Chinese miners in the gold rush era. The tax started at $20 per month, was soon repealed and reinstated in 1852 at $4 per month. Those who refused to pay the tax were not allowed to work or harassed and robbed by tax collectors. Some Americans even pretended to be tax collectors just to steal from the non-English speaking Chicanos and Chinese workers. With this development came resistance from many. One such resistor was Joaquin Murieta, a miner affected by the hysteria of the foreign miners tax law and American jingoism. Murieta's brother was hanged and his wife raped by white supremacists. Murieta then predictably dedicated his life to war on the oppressor nation. Chicanos were told by America to use its court system to obtain justice, but courts always sided with Anglos on land disputes, and many Chicanos did not have money for expensive lawyers. Further, most did not speak English or understand the tax laws themselves. Years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Genocidal murder of Chicanos by the oppressor nation was used to clear people from land and ensure domination of the white nation. We know that thousands of Chicanos were lynched by Americans from 1848 to 1928. Although the most thorough research on this topic documents only about 547 specific cases, these occurred across Aztlan, but also in places like Nebraska and Wyoming, making Mexicans the second biggest target of white violence after New Africans during this time period. The overall account of total lynchings is not accurately known because people were usually recorded as, quote, black or, quote, white in historical records from the time. The conditions were for Chicanos what they are for all colonized people. As Comrade Stalin stated, quote, imperialism is the most barefaced exploitation and the most inhumane oppression of hundreds of millions of people inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. The purpose of this oppression is to squeeze out super profits. But in exploiting these countries, imperialism is compelled to build their railways, factories, and mills, industrial and commercial centers. The appearance of a class of proletarians, the emergence of a native intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness, the growth of the liberation movement. Such are the inevitable results of this policy. The growth of the revolutionary movement in all colonies and dependent countries, without exception, clearly testifies to this fact. End quote. Many Chicanos rose in the defense of the people as national consciousness grew in opposition to American imperialism. Juan Cheno Cortina led a resistance movement beginning in 1859, arming and mobilizing over 1,000 people into a militia that fought white supremacy near Brownsville, Texas. Cortina waged war on those oppressing Chicanos. Gregorio Cortez was another Chicano hero who rose up in Texas to resist white supremacy, eluding posses of racists and inspiring many to join his militia. Catarino Garza was another such leader, also in Texas. In California, Joaquin Urieta formed a militia to fight the oppressor nation, and Tiburcio Vasquez led armed resistance to the occupation and oppression. Out of all the states in the quote-unquote Southwest, after 1848, Texas experienced the most bloody armed resistance, and New Mexico served as the most organized resistance for Chicanos. One of the more revolutionary groups was Las Gorras Blancas, the Whitecaps, which rose in New Mexico in 1889 and initiated armed offensives on America, including sabotage, destroying railroads, cutting telegraph lines, torching oppressor nation ranches, and organizing Chicanos in guerrilla warfare units. Most of their attacks were directed at large landowners who had appropriated communal lands, and they enjoyed the support of most of the Chicano residents in San Miguel County, New Mexico, where they were active. La Mano Negra, the Black Hand, was another group to form at the time in New Mexico and was active around the same time as Las Gorras Blancas. This group eventually succumbed to brown bourgeois politicians. The Mexicano radicals Enrique and Ricardo Flores Magón would further mobilize Chicanos in Aztlan. The Magons led the Mexican political party Partido Liberal Mexicano, Mexican Liberal Party, which was very active in Mexico and the United States in the early 1900s due to the repression they faced and because of the bubbling social conditions in Mexico. They crossed into the United States to continue their work of agitating and educating the people. It was the Magons who created the slogan Emiliano Zapata would use, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. When the brothers crossed into the United States, they started a newspaper, Regeneration, which served to build public opinion here in Aztlan. about the oppression of Mexicanos faced from the Mexican tyrants in power as well as from Americans in the United Snakes. Regeneration was probably the most revolutionary newspaper for Raza at that time. In the pages of Regeneration, one learned of Raza being lynched by the oppressor nation, strikes that Chicanos were involved in, police brutality, and other oppression. The PLM provided the theoretical heartbeat of the social movement that would become the Mexican Revolution of 1910. It was in the pages of Regeneration that the Mexican Revolution of 1910 was explained as a battle between quote unquote capital and labor. Eventually, the U.S. government decided to put a stop to their activities, arresting and sentencing the Magons to prison in 1916, charging them with mailing obscene material, something we can all relate to with the modern censorship of nationalist literature in U.S. prisons. The Magons and the PLM helped to raise the consciousness of Chicanos, Mexicanos, and especially women. Their efforts toward gender equality unleashed women to organize political groups such as Hijas de Anahuac, Daughters of Anahuac. Revolution in Mexico, 1910. The revolutionary struggle that occurred in Mexico with Pancho Villa in the north and Emiliano Zapata in the south was the most profound event thus far in the history of the Mexican people. Although this revolution did not culminate in socialism in Mexico, it was an advance in the struggle against oppression that brought agrarian reforms and toppled brutal tyrants of the era. The tangible progress gained did not last long in the physical sense, but in the ideological sense of the mobilization of millions in Mexico, and especially women who were active participants on all levels of the Mexican Revolution, gave a huge morale boost to generations of Mexican people. This is true for today's Chicanos, as many of our grandparents were participants in the Mexican Revolution, and we recall the struggle for liberation to personal stories. The oppressor nation would see the Mexican Revolution differently, calling Villa and Zapata monsters or bandits. The oppressor will always paint a hero of the oppressed in this way. We need only look to current events in the corporate news media to see heroes of the oppressed such as Muammar Gaddafi or Kim Il-sung dehumanized by the American propaganda media outlets, but their people love them. And despite of the nominal liberation from Spain 90 years earlier, by 1910, almost 99% of the Mexican population was landless, suffering at the hands of hacendados and patrones in a feudal system dominated by a small Spanish elite. The biggest contradiction that played out internally in the Mexican Revolution was the contradiction between those who used and depended on the land and those who owned and controlled it. The rise of U.S. imperialism that developed in the late 19th century exacerbated the class contradictions within Mexico by extracting wealth as well as a section of the emerging proletariat itself into newly expanded U.S. borders. The insatiable appetite for ever more resources led America to sink its bloody fangs into Mexico's resource-rich land. This ravaging of Mexican land led many Mexicanos to migrate into the brutal work conditions in the American-owned mines. American capitalists bought Mexican mines, invested in textile mills, and created other industries in Mexico in order to exploit cheap labor. Mexico was used as America's sweatshop, making Mexican people work themselves to injury, illness, and death. While American capitalists increased their bank accounts and American settlers served as overseers and enforcers on their behalf. This stunted the development of the Mexican bourgeoisie, putting them in contradiction with the interests of American capital. Therefore, a broad national unity in opposition to the forces of both feudalism and U.S. imperialism fueled the revolution of 1910. In the end, land was finally given to those who had been working it for centuries. However, this was a bourgeois revolution that replaced one ruler out for power and profit for a few with another seeking profit and power for their small privileged group. The Mexican bourgeoisie gained power and has been slowly reverting gains from the revolution ever since. While land redistribution undercut the feudal class, the Mexican Revolution was also a blow to U.S. imperialism in that it nationalized the industries and mines of the North. These changes were embraced by the vast majority of Mexican people, as was seen after the revolution, when Mexicanos en masse donated everything from jewelry to the few pesos they had to the new government in order to help rebuild the war-torn country. The author of Mexico's Revolution Then and Now, James Cockcroft, asserts four important lessons of the revolution in 1910 through 1917 are: 1. The danger of handing over weapons permanently and of trusting peace officers, the Zapatistas in Morelos in 1911. The importance of unity and the trap of permitting the creation of an antagonistic division between the working class and the peasantry, the Red Battalions of the Casa del Obrero Mundial in 1915. 3. The need to recognize and incorporate the demands and special needs of specific groups of the oppressed, such as women, the original peoples, and people of diverse sexual preferences. And 4. The importance of a genuine internationalism and anti-imperialism. Another lesson to add to Cockcroft's list is the need for a communist-led revolution. Without this component, all the years of work will ultimately be reversed and reduced to a bourgeois nationalist revolution. Lenin's Russia was the first government to put this Marxist concept into practice. What many do not realize is that a dictatorship will exist one way or another, whether it is the rich dictating to the poor or the oppressed over the former oppressors. So long as classes exist, one class will wield power over another. The dictatorship of the proletariat occurs when historically oppressed people are in command to keep the oppressors in check after a revolution so they don't restore capitalism. Mexico is an example of what happens when a dictatorship of the proletariat is not enacted, and so the oppressors remain and can easily get back in power and reverse advances made by the revolution. While fighting was contained mostly to Mexico's boundaries, there was a massive dispersal caused by the war, which had a huge impact on the Chicano nation. Most peasant families lost their homes in the chaos and destruction that ensued. At the time the war kicked off, most of Mexico was already in economic ruin due to the blend of prevailing feudal relations in the countryside and the phenomenon of rising capitalism. Together, these conditions would ordinarily cause the peasant population to proletarianize by migration into the cities and industrial centers. However, Mexico was a neo-colony in the grips of early American imperialism with no industry of its own. The peasants naturally looked north over the border to greener pastures and the possibility of eking out an existence. These conditions produced a huge wave of Mexican migration into Aztlan. The influx of labor increased the development of American capitalist production in the agricultural sector. Mining continued to develop as well, but the greatest growth for American capitalism came in cotton production. Chicanos and new migrants from Mexico worked in Aztlan, just like their new African counterparts. The vast majority of labor industries in the quote-unquote Southwest United States were using Chicano and Mexicano workers during this period. In the mines, where Chicanos experienced some of the most brutal work conditions, Chicanos organized the most. What Chairman Mao Zedong, who led Communist China to victory over Japanese imperialism, said decades later about finding the most resistance where you find the most repression, was being played out in the Chicano nation. As Chicanos began organizing militant labor organizations throughout Aztlan, the oppressor nation was using racist militia and corporate henchmen, including police, to destroy these organizations. These militant labor organizations were forming because at this time, many white unions would not allow Chicanos to join, and thus Raza had to create their own labor unions. Militant labor actions by the Chicano nation culminated in what has come to be called the Ludlow Massacre, which some call the most significant labor strike in the history of the United Snakes. Close to 10,000 workers, mostly Chicanos, decided to strike in Ludlow, Colorado. In April 1914, to demand changes to the horrible work conditions, these workers were employed by Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which was mostly owned by the Rockefellers. 50 workers were killed when the National Guard was called in to attack the workers' camp, which also took the lives of family of these workers. It was without a doubt a horrible massacre, but to Chicanos, even more brutal events were taking place concurrently in Arizona's labor struggles. The pages of Regeneration reported on a quote-unquote a war of races in Arizona. And even the Los Angeles Times reported on this quote-unquote race war. In reality, this was an oppressor nation war on Chicanos, and Chicanos resisting the oppression of white supremacy. Conditions for Chicanos in the mines were appalling. In the mines of Dawson, New Mexico, 600 mostly Chicano miners died in the three mine disasters of 1913, 1920, and 1923. There were conflicting currents in the United States in the early 1900s, with demand for cheap labor fueling immigration of Mexicanos and white supremacist sentiments pushing to clear Mexicanos out of the country. As Aviva Chomsky writes in her book Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal, quote, when Congress passed the Literary Act for Immigrants in 1917, railroad, agricultural, and mining corporations raised a howl of protest and insisted that an open border was essential in order to obtain the labor they needed. In response, Congress quickly exempted Mexicans from the literacy requirement. Migration ebbed and flowed directly in response to employment demands in the United Snakes. When they needed workers, employers turned to Mexico. When they didn't, as in 1929, when Depression-era unemployment began to rise, the State Department instructed consular officers to increase their enforcement of the likely to become a public charge restriction on would-be immigrants and refused to grant entry visas to Mexicans unlikely to find work. On the other hand, the American propaganda arm, like the Hearst newspapers, was fueling white supremacy by accusing Chicanos and migrating Mexicanos of everything from a revolution in the quote-unquote Southwest to an invasion of quote-unquote Mexican Reds, and plotting with the German Nazis. The hysteria-filled Chicano oppression fueled Chicano oppression, with many American politicians wanting to enforce deportations of raza. But at the same time, America was faced with a labor shortage due to World War I, with many workers going off to fight in the war, and thus the influx of Mexican workers was welcome. What was common at the time in Aztlan was a form of serfdom, where ranchers would hire migrant workers and enforce ridiculous terms to their working conditions. When the workers refused the ranchers, the local deputies would have the Chicanos charged with vagrancy and ensure they worked on this ranch to work off their quote-unquote debt to the boss. In this way, the ranchers kept Chicano workers in debt peonage. This practice was also used for decades against new Africans in the quote unquote Southwest states where slavery was illegal. Up until the early part of the 20th century, Chicanos represented a colonial labor force for the most part. Even though a wide range of classes developed in the Chicano nation, each class was still marginalized from white America. Chicanos of different classes were still restricted to the same barrios, where Chicano merchants were restricted to selling to Chicanos. The Chicano lawyers were restricted to representing Chicanos, etc. This does not imply, of course, that Chicanos are all motivated equally. Political views come into play and class contradictions develop even within the internal colony. Once more, as the oppression grew, so did the resistance. One such form of resistance manifested in the Plan de San Diego and shortly thereafter the sediciosos. During the first decade of the 1900s, a group of unidentified Mexicanos or Chicanos put out a document calling for armed resistance by Chicanos. The Plan de San Diego called for armed struggle against America and proclaimed that upon victory, the quote unquote Southwest United Snakes would become a Chicano state, new Africans would form their own state, and First Nations their own state. This was the first united front of the oppressed nations on these shores that sought independence for all oppressed nations upon victory. The plan demonstrated true internationalism. The most controversial part of the first version of the Plan de San Diego was its call to execute all white males in the Southwest over the age of 16, as well as anyone encountered with a gun who could not prove a right to bear arms. But it is not known whether this provision was actually in the original Spanish version or was inserted by government to justify violence against Chicanos. Basilio Ramos was arrested after he attempted to recruit a friend of the sheriff's to the cause of the revolution. He was captured with the Spanish version of the plan, but it did not survive his arrest. A second version of the plan was issued on the day the original plan called for the revolution to start, titled Manifesto a los Pueblos Oprimidos de América, which had none of the original signatories to the Plan de San Diego, but had 9 new signatories identifying themselves as the Revolutionary Congress created by the Plan de San Diego. The second version dropped the call for execution of white males and focused on the oppression and liberation of Chicanos. Quote, whereas the document in Ramos's possession avoided mention of the land question or economic radicalism, the manifesto openly proclaimed the movement's goal as a, quote, social revolution and called for the return of all arable lands to the hands of proletarians and combatants for the revolution, who could either keep the land in individual hands or proclaim complete communization as they see fit. All railroads and means of public transportation were to be collectivized, and the new nation would create modern schools where universal love would be taught to students without regard to their race or nationality. The document subsumed the provisions of the original plan, adding Utah and Nevada to the list of states to be liberated. This second version of the plan ended with the hope that the struggle would spread beyond the new republic to all oppressed people of all despised races who would one day overthrow their oppressors and join the concert of universal fraternity, end quote. The sediciosos, inspired by the Plan de San Diego, carried out raids and military actions throughout Texas before the uprising was ended in July 1916 by the U.S. military and vigilante response. Additional militant actions in Texas and elsewhere continued, inspired by the plan in years to come. In response to these military actions by Chicanos, there was an aggressive and violent counterstrike by the white nation, especially in Texas. Americans did not just strike back at Chicanos who were suspected of involvement. They seized the opportunity to punish any Chicano against whom they held a grudge. Land owning Chicanos were at particular risk for violence. Chicanos were murdered, raped, run off their land, and kept from participating in any part of the political or legal system. In 1915 through 1916, it is estimated that thousands of Chicanos were executed in South Texas in response to the Plan de San Diego. None of the guilty white supremacists were ever brought to justice, and in many cases, the crimes were perpetuated by the police or the Texas Rangers.